as Secretary of Defense. The news coming up. Iraqi resistance. Political groups vow to confront continued U.S. military presence. This is from Press TV. Iraqi resistance and political groups have taken strong exception to the Pentagon chief's unannounced visit to Baghdad and Washington's intent to continue its military presence in the Arab country on the pretext of preserving its stability. Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, made a surprise visit to the Iraqi capital on Wednesday ahead of the 20th anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion of the country that was followed by the collapse of the regime of former dictator Saddam Hussein, which plunged the Arab country into crisis. In Baghdad, Austin announced Washington's intent to maintain the military presence that began with the U.S. invasion in 2003, and it continued for the 20 years since, expressing hope to strengthen and broaden relations with Iraq. U.S. forces are ready to remain in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq, Austin told reporters after meeting Iraqi Premier Mohammed al-Sudani. The United States will continue to strengthen and broaden our partnership in support of Iraqi security, stability, and sovereignty. Austin, the most senior official in President Joe Biden's administration to visit Iraq, was the last commanding general of U.S. forces there after the invasion. Iraqi political groups and resistance factions severely censored the visit as an insult to the blood of martyrs and a brazen act, stressing that they'll not wait for any permission to expel the occupation forces from their country. They reaffirmed their pledge to end the American occupation and expel the occupying forces. They slammed the Pentagon chief's remarks that hinted at the continued American military presence in the Arab country. The visit came as the anti-occupation voices have grown louder in Iraq, calling for the immediate ouster of American occupying forces and denouncing the visits of senior American political and military officials. Abu Ali al-Askari, who is in charge of the Security Bureau of Iraq's anti-terror Kataib Hezbollah, in a tweet said, "The visit of the American war minister to Iraq was an insult to the martyrs, the nation, and the history of this country." Stressing that Kataib Hezbollah will not commit to any understanding between the political parties and the occupying forces, Askari said the resistance group will not wait for anyone's permission to confront the occupation. Some political parties and their leaders should know that they should be careful in dealing with the enemy, whether in the clothing of a diplomat or in the clothing of a warrior, and remember that politicians claim to represent a nation that's against foreign domination, he remarked. U.S. hands stained with the blood of top martyrs. Hassan Salam, a representative of the Sarakun coalition at the Iraqi parliament, which is close to the anti-terror Asaib al-Haq resistance group, also blasted the Pentagon chief's visit to Iraq. To the occupying U.S. defense minister, "I condemn your trip, and I do not welcome you because your hands are stained with the blood of Iraqi martyrs, especially the martyred commanders of victory Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Qasem Soleimani," Salam noted. Resistance will not yield to any form of pressure. The Kataib Said al-Shuhuda anti-terror resistance group also censored the U.S. official's visit to Iraq and said it would not give in to the pressure and would press ahead with the expulsion of the occupiers. Until now, the American occupier has not looked at Iraq as a part of the circle of allies in which it walks with security, and this security is the result of the blood of martyrs of resistance, the resistance group said in a statement. This honor suffices for the Iraqi resistance that the occupying minister enters Iraq in a humble, fearful, and worried manner, like the formal official of his country, Donald Trump, who had to move between several planes in the dark of night during his trip to Iraq for fear of being hit by the resistance, it added. The Kataib Said al-Shuhuda anti-terror resistance group, underlined that the resistance will not yield to any form of pressure, adding that it will wait but will not abandon its main goals of expelling the occupier from Iraq and ending all forms of occupation. Meanwhile, the Fatah Conquest Alliance in the Iraqi parliament said the country's resistance and political groups agree on the need to expel all American troops, noting that this is a definitive and national decision rather than a factional one. On March 19th, 2003, the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq in blatant violation of international law. And it was under the pretext of finding weapons of mass destruction, but no such weapons were ever discovered in Iraq. More than 1 million Iraqis were killed as the result of the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of the country, according to the California-based investigative organization Project Censored. Since the U.S.-led forces ousted Saddam's regime, Iraq has been self-governed under a power-sharing system. The U.S. withdrew its forces in 2011, claiming it had ended its combat mission in Iraq. However, some 2,500 U.S. troops still remain inside the Arab country on what Washington describes as an advisory mission. Calls for ouster of U.S. troops. Since the assassination of top anti-terror commanders, the commander of the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, IRGC, Quds Force, General Qasem Soleimani, and Deputy Chief of Iraq's Resistance Alliance, Hashd-e-Shabi, in a U.S. airstrike in Baghdad on January 3, 2020, the chorus against the American occupation has grown louder and stronger. Immediately after the dastardly crime, the Iraq parliament passed a resolution that called for the expulsion of occupying American forces, which was unanimously backed by Iraqi's political and resistance groups. Over the past 3 years, the military convoys and facilities belonging to the occupying forces have been frequently targeted by Iraqi resistance groups, demonstrating the overwhelmingly popular opinion in the country against the continued American presence. Iranian authorities have also repeatedly called for the ouster of American forces from the region, including Iraq, pointing to their destabilizing activities that are not in favor of regional countries. The anti-occupation and anti-war voices inside the U.S. have been calling for the exit of American forces from Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other countries, which they say has failed to serve any purpose. Jacob G. Hornberger, the founder and president of the U.S.-based Future of Freedom Foundation, in an article published on the FFF website in January, asked why shouldn't Americans be brought up on criminal charges for contributing to the unprovoked murder of all those Iraqi children. One irony is that Saddam Hussein, whom U.S. officials were calling the new Hitler, had been a partner and ally of U.S. officials in the 1980s when he was waging an unprovoked war of aggression against Iran, he wrote. U.S. officials were supporting Saddam in his war of aggression because they loved the fact that his army was killing Iranians. And from Memo, U.S. Defense Secretary makes unannounced visit to Iraq 20 years after invasion. The United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin today arrived in Iraq on an unannounced visit. This is from March 7th, or two days ago, late on March 7th. He arrived in Iraq on an unannounced visit to discuss continued defense cooperation and to affirm Washington's partnership with Baghdad. After beginning his Middle East tour on Sunday in Jordan, in which he met with King Abdullah, it was expected that Austin would later visit Israel and Egypt for discussions on regional issues and to reiterate the U.S.'s commitment to its allies in the region. The unannounced visit to Iraq today, therefore, came as a surprise. I'm here to reaffirm the U.S.-Iraq strategic partnership as we move toward a more secure, stable, and sovereign Iraq, the Defense Secretary stated on Twitter. A Pentagon statement also emphasized that he shared his concerns on a range of shared challenges, including maintaining focus on security and stability in Iraq and countering other destabilizing activities in the region. In an address to media in Baghdad today following his meeting with Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani and Defense Minister Thabet Mohammed al-Abbasi, Austin stated that the visit and engagements underscore the U.S. commitment to expanding our partnership with the people and the government of Iraq. We're deeply committed to ensuring that the Iraqi people can live in peace and dignity, with safety and security, and with economic opportunity for all. Emphasizing the role of the U.S. military and its leading of the international coalition against Daesh, he called the defense cooperation between Washington and Baghdad a key pillar of our bilateral relationship, and the United States remains committed to this fight in support of Iraq's security and the security of the entire region. Prime Minister Soudani and I both reaffirmed that commitment today. Austin also stated that the U.S. forces are ready to remain in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq. These forces are operating in a non-combat advise, assist, and enable role to support the Iraqi-led fight against terrorism. He warned that in order to do so, however, we must be able to operate safely and securely to continue this vital work, referring to the threats and attacks against American bases and military personnel within Iraq by Iran-backed Shia militias, many of which are aligned with and operate alongside Iraq's military. I want to thank Prime Minister Soudani and Minister of Defense Abbasi for their commitment today to ensure that the coalition forces in Iraq, at the Iraqi government's request, will be protected from state and non-state actors, the Defense Secretary said. He further assured the U.S. is focused on the mission of defeating Daesh, and we're here for no other purpose, and threats or attacks on our forces only undermine that mission. The surprise visit to Iraq by America's top defense official comes almost 2 decades after the U.S.-led invasion of the country in 2003. From Al Jazeera, Pentagon chief on surprise trip says U.S. troops to stay in Iraq. And Baghdad Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin pledges continued U.S. troop presence in his fight against ISIL. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has made an unannounced trip to Iraq, during which he said the United States is committed to keeping its military presence in the country and continuing the fight against ISIL. The Pentagon's chief's trip to Baghdad on Tuesday came just before the 20-year anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion in Iraq in 2003, which led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians, toppled leader Saddam Hussein, and helped unleash forces that paved the way to the rise of ISIL. The U.S. withdrew its forces in 2011, but the administration of former President Barack Obama sent thousands of soldiers back into Iraq and neighboring Syria 3 years later to bolster the fight against ISIL. Currently, the U.S. has 2,500 soldiers in Iraq and 900 in Syria to help advise and assist local forces in combating ISIL, which in 2014 seized swaths of territory in both countries. Despite their territorial defeat in Iraq in late 2017, ISIL fighters are still launching attacks in the country as well as in Syria. ISIL attacks have killed and wounded dozens of Iraqi soldiers in recent months. We're focused on the mission of defeating Daesh, ISIL, and we're here for no other purpose, Austin said. Any threats or attacks on our forces only undermine that mission. He added, apparently referring to Iraq-backed fighters who have been blamed for attacks on facilities housing U.S. troops in Iraq. Austin, the most senior official in President Joe Biden's administration to visit Iraq in recent years, was the last commanding general of U.S. forces there after the invasion. U.S. forces are ready to remain in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq, Austin told reporters after meeting Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed al-Soudani and Defense Minister Thabet Mohammed al-Abbasi. He said these forces are operating in a non-combat and advisory role in support of the Iraqi-led fight against terrorism. The United States will continue to strengthen and broaden our partnerships in support of Iraqi security, stability, and sovereignty, he said. Al-Soudani's office, meanwhile, said he and Austin discussed cooperation between their countries in the fight against ISIL. The Prime Minister reaffirmed his government's keenness to strengthen and consolidate relations with the United States of America at various levels and fields. And from Al Monitor, Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin talks troops' presence in surprise Iraq visit. Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Soudani is playing a delicate balance act with pro-Iran factions as Washington keeps a low profile for its military advisors in Iraq in order to subdue the Islamic State. More than 11 years after he led the last U.S. battalions out of Iraq, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin landed in Baghdad on Wednesday to discuss the future of the U.S. troop presence in the country with Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Soudani. Following the meeting, Austin said that the current 2,500 troops in the country as part of the U.S.-led coalition to defeat the Islamic State were ready to remain there at the behest of the Iraqi government. Now looking forward, U.S. forces are ready to remain in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq, Austin said, according to reporters traveling with him. And from Wa'ali, U.S. Secretary of Defense meets with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and this is in Egypt. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin arrived in Egypt today, where he met with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The two leaders discussed improving the strategic partnership, military cooperation, and mutual security between their countries. The Defense Secretary and the Egyptian President also discussed the growing tension between Israel and Palestine in the West Bank. Lloyd Austin has also visited Jordan and Iraq before arriving in Cairo. He met with the President of Egypt and at the Presidential Palace. It should be noted that Egypt receives military aid of $1.3 billion every year from the United States. After arriving in Cairo, the U.S. Secretary of Defense tweeted that the defense partnership between the U.S. and Egypt is an important pillar of our commitment to the region. He said that I've come to discuss opportunities to strengthen cooperation on important issues and deepen the long bilateral partnership with Egypt. And from Al-Madin, U.S. Defense Chief optimistic about the future of U.S.-Iraqi partnership. An Iraqi government spokesperson confirms that the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin discussed with the Iraqi Prime Minister and Defense Minister counterterrorism training programs. Iraqi government spokesperson Bassem al-Awadi said on Tuesday that the Iraqi government discussed training programs for the Iraqi armed forces with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who had arrived on an unannounced visit to Baghdad on the same day. Austin said in a tweet which he attached to the video of the moment he arrived in Iraq that he is here to reaffirm the strategic partnership between the United States and Iraq. During the visit, as reported by AFP, Austin told Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani that U.S. troops were ready to remain in the country at Baghdad's invitation, adding, "We must be able to operate safely and securely to continue this vital work." Moreover, the Pentagon official acknowledged efforts by al-Sudani and Iraqi Defense Minister Thabet al-Abbasi for their commitment to ensure that the coalition forces in Iraq will be protected from state and non-state actors. On its part, al-Sudani's office reaffirmed what Austin had tweeted, adding that the Prime Minister said Baghdad's been committed to maintaining balanced relations with the regional and international powers. According to the spokesman, there's an emphasis on joint cooperation between the two countries on the issue of combating terrorism, which is a priority topic during most visits of military leaders to Iraq. The parties also discussed programs for the development and training of the Iraqi forces. This unannounced visit kicked off in Jordan on Sunday, aiming to assure key allies of the U.S. commitment to the region, despite Washington's focus on Russia and China. It's noteworthy that Iraq announced in January 2021 the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, while maintaining the relationship with foreign forces in the field of training and empowerment. This visit comes before the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq on March 19, 2003, with Austin being the later commander-in-chief of U.S. forces in Iraq. The U.S. official's visit to Baghdad was also preceded by an unannounced visit by U.S. Chairman and the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, to Israel first, then to the U.S.-occupied Al-Tanf base in northeastern Syria. Damascus condemns U.S. General Milley's illegal visit to northeast Syria. That's a different topic. And from Al Arabiya News, Pentagon chief pledges continued U.S. forces presence in Iraq during visit to Baghdad. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin making an unannounced trip to Iraq on Tuesday, nearly 20 years after the U.S.-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein, said Washington was committed to keeping its military presence in the country. The 2003 invasion led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians and created instability that eventually paved the way for the rise of ISIS militants after the U.S. withdrew its forces in 2011. Austin, the most senior official in President Joe Biden's administration to visit Iraq, was the last commanding general of U.S. forces there after the invasion. U.S. forces are ready to remain in Iraq at the invitation of the government of Iraq, Austin told reporters after meeting Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani. Al-Sudani later said in a statement that his government's approach is to maintain balanced relations with regional and international governments based on shared interest and respect for sovereignty, and that the stability of Iraq is the key to security and stability of the region. The U.S. currently has 2,500 troops in Iraq and an additional 900 in Syria to help advise and assist local troops in combating ISIS, who in 2014 seized swaths of territory in 2014 in both countries. ISIS is far from the formidable force it once was, but militant cells have survived across parts of northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. Austin's trip is about support and Sudani's pushback against Iranian influence in the country, or supporting Sudani's pushback against Iranian influence in the country, former officials and experts say. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq have occasionally targeted U.S. forces and its embassy in Baghdad with rockets. The United States and Iran came close to full-blown conflict in 2020 after U.S. forces killed Iran's Revolutionary Guards Commander General Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike. I think that Iraqi leaders share our interest in Iraq not becoming a playground for conflict between the United States and Iran, a senior U.S. defense official speaking on condition of anonymity said. This is very biased, and the fact that they have to quote a U.S. official that is speaking under the condition of anonymity is super important there. And Austin met al-Sudani and will meet the president of the Iraqi Kurdistan region, Nechir van Barzani, amid a long-running dispute over budget transfers and oil revenue sharing between the national government and the Kurdish government. Former President George W. Bush's administration cited its belief that the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein government held weapons of mass destruction to justify the decision to invade Iraq. U.S. and allied forces later found that such stockpiles did not exist. Between 185,000 and 208,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in the war, according to the Cost of War project by the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. Austin, a former head of all U.S. forces in the Middle East, said in 2011 that the U.S. had achieved its military objectives in Iraq, but under former President Obama, the United States sent thousands of troops back into Iraq and Syria 3 years later to bolster the fight against ISIS. And from Arab News, U.S. Defense Secretary aims to reassure Middle East allies. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in Jordan to begin a 3-country Mideast visit is aiming to reassure key allies of American commitment to the region despite Washington's recent focus on Russia and China, officials say. The Pentagon chief, who arrived in Amman on Sunday, is expected to press Israel leaders to reduce tensions in the West Bank and work to strengthen ties in talks with Egyptian leaders. We've demonstrated over and over again that we can rapidly surge capability to any part of the globe that we need to, but especially here in the Middle East because we've operated here for 20 plus years. Austin told reporters while visiting a joint training center near Amman. The United States has about 30,000 troops in the region and is seen as pivotal in helping counter Iranian influence. Retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, who headed American forces in the Middle East until last year, said the region is significant to the United States. I think this trip's an excellent example for an opportunity to continue to tell people in the theater region that they remain important to us, added McKenzie, now leading the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. The United States last week demanded that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repudiate a call by his hardline finance minister Bezalel Smotrich for a Flashpoint Palestinian village to be erased, a comment that Netanyahu on Sunday called inappropriate. The U.S. State Department has called Smotrich's comment repugnant. Austin will also be quite frank with Israeli leaders about his concerns regarding the cycle of violence in the West Bank and consult on what steps Israeli leaders can take to meaningfully restore calm before the upcoming holidays, a senior U.S. defense official said, speaking on the condition of the anonymity. The Pentagon said Austin had discussed his concern about the escalation in tensions in the West Bank and Jerusalem during a meeting with Jordan King's Abdullah on Sunday. Okay, watch this space. Remember that your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.